The processing building had concrete floors and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. Women got separated into smaller groups, directed to different tables where American personnel sat with clipboards and expressions of professional detachment. Greta found herself standing before a folding table where a woman in a Red Cross uniform was writing something in careful script. The woman looked up and her face registered as unremarkable at first glance, thin and drawn with dark shadows under her eyes like she hadn't slept properly in weeks. But her gaze was direct, meeting Greta's eyes instead of looking through her the way guards usually did with prisoners. She said something in English that came too fast for Greta to catch, then switched languages mid-sentence, her German careful and slightly accented but completely clear. "Name," she said, and Greta heard the precision in how she formed the vowels, the way someone who'd learned the language young but not as their only language would speak. Muller, Greta Muller. Her own voice came out rougher than intended, scraped raw from 2 weeks of salt air and fear. The Red Cross woman wrote it down in neat block letters. "Date of birth?" she asked, and Greta answered automatically while her mind stayed focused on the photograph, on keeping it hidden, on not shifting her weight in a way that might dislodge it. But bodies betray intentions. She moved slightly and felt the picture slip, just a fraction of movement, then gravity took over. The photograph tumbled out from inside her sock and landed face up on the concrete, Annalise's gap-toothed smile looking up at both of them like an accusation or a plea, or maybe just evidence that normal life had existed once and might exist again. Time did something strange, stretching thin and elastic. Greta stared down at her daughter's face, at the dark braids she'd woven that last morning 18 months ago before the transport orders came through, at the school dress with its white collar that was probably too small now if Annalise was even still alive, if Greta's mother had managed to keep her safe through whatever was happening back in Bavaria. Her breath stopped completely. This was the moment when punishment would come, when the mask of professional courtesy would drop and reveal the cruelty underneath. They'd confiscate the photograph. They'd question her about it, demand to know why she had contraband, use it as leverage for information she didn't have. They'd destroy it just to demonstrate power, to remind her she owned nothing, not even memories. The American woman bent down, her movements deliberate and careful. She picked up the photograph and held it with both hands, studying the image for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. Greta watched her face for signs of mockery or disgust, or the particular kind of cruelty that presents itself as kindness before twisting into something worse. But the woman's expression just showed a deep, bone-tired sadness that seemed to come from somewhere far away. She looked up, met Greta's eyes again, and spoke in that careful German. "She's beautiful." Then she held the photograph out, offering it back, returning what any guard in any camp would have kept or destroyed. "You'll see her again." Greta's hand shook so badly she nearly dropped the photograph a second time when she took it. The paper felt heavier than it had before, weighted with something she couldn't name. She searched the American woman's face for deception, for some hidden agenda, but found only that same exhausted sadness that looked like it had worn grooves into her features over time. "Thank you," Greta whispered, and the words felt like betraying everything she'd been taught about Americans, about enemies, about how the world worked. The woman nodded once and made a notation on her clipboard. Ruth, her name tag read, Ruth Stein. The surname registered somewhere in Greta's mind as possibly Jewish, probably Jewish, which meant this woman helping her process into detention was someone whose people the Reich had declared enemies of the state. The irony made Greta's head spin. That first night in the barracks, lying on a mattress that was thin but real, under a roof that didn't leak, Greta tucked the photograph under her pillow and stared at ceiling boards she could actually see instead of darkness or sky. The barracks had screens on the windows and enough space between bunks that you could move without stepping on someone. Women whispered around her, their voices carrying confusion and suspicion in equal measure. Liesel's voice cut through sharper than the others. They're softening us up, making us weak and grateful so we'll betray our country, betray our men who are still fighting. Don't trust any of it." Other voices murmured agreement, but Greta couldn't stop replaying the moment Ruth had returned the photograph, the gentleness in how she'd held it, the way she'd looked at Annalise's face like it mattered that a German prisoner was also a mother who missed her child. If that small act of mercy was genuine, what else might be real that contradicted everything the propaganda had promised? And if they'd been lied to about Americans, systematically and thoroughly, what other lies had she swallowed without question? The thought terrified her more than any threat of physical violence ever could, because violence you could understand and prepare for, but lies that reshaped your entire understanding of reality left you with nowhere solid to stand. The laundry detail started 3 days later and became the rhythm Greta wrapped her days around. 6 mornings a week she stood at industrial sinks with 5 other women, scrubbing olive-green American uniforms and white cotton sheets until her hands turned red and raw and then calloused. The work was mindless enough that her thoughts could circle endlessly while her body went through motions that required no conscious attention. She scrubbed and rinsed and wrung and hung, and while her hands worked, she thought about the food that arrived 3 times daily, plain but adequate, nobody going hungry. She thought about the guards who maintained professional distance, not friendly but not cruel either, just doing a job that apparently didn't require cruelty to accomplish. She thought about the barracks that had real beds and roofs that kept rain out and windows with screens that let air in while keeping insects out. She thought about how none of this matched what she'd been prepared for, and the dissonance made her feel untethered from anything solid or knowable. The propaganda had been specific about what Americans did to prisoners: starvation, beatings, humiliation, forced labor that killed you slowly. She'd believed it because why wouldn't she? Because questioning official information had never occurred to her as something you could do, because teachers were supposed to trust authority and convey that trust to students. But here she was being fed adequately and housed decently and allowed to keep a photograph of her daughter, and the cognitive dissonance felt like standing on ground that kept shifting under her feet. The absence of expected cruelty was somehow more disorienting than cruelty would have been, because cruelty you could hate cleanly, could use to fuel defiance and solidarity. But this bureaucratic efficiency combined with small mercies left her with nothing to push against, nothing to help her maintain the clear divisions between us and them that war required. Ruth appeared at the laundry station most afternoons, clipboard in hand, ostensibly checking on supplies or asking if anyone needed medical attention. She never lingered, never forced conversation, but Greta found herself watching the Red Cross woman with increasing attention. Other American staff rotated through, different faces and voices, but Ruth was constant, and there was something about her that nagged at Greta's mind. The way she spoke German wasn't just competent, it was native-level fluent, with an accent that spoke of childhood acquisition, not adult study. The slight hesitations before certain words suggested she was translating from English in her head, but the underlying structure was German through and through. Greta had taught language long enough to recognize the difference between learned fluency and native fluency, and Ruth had the latter overlaid with years of speaking something else. One afternoon in late September, while hanging sheets on outdoor lines that stretched between wooden posts, Greta overheard Ruth speaking with another Red Cross worker near the fence. They were talking in English, the words coming too fast for Greta to follow completely with her limited vocabulary, but certain key words emerged clear enough: Germany, Frankfurt, parents. The grief in Ruth's voice transcended language barriers, coming through in tone and pacing and the catch in her breath that Greta recognized from her own moments of breaking. That night, lying in her bunk while other women slept or pretended to sleep, Greta assembled the pieces. Ruth's German was native because she'd been born there, raised there, learned the language before she learned anything else. The American overlay meant emigration, probably forced emigration given the timing and her Jewish surname. She was one of us, Greta thought. and the realization landed with uncomfortable weight. One of us and one of them simultaneously, standing in some impossible middle ground that Greta couldn't quite comprehend, helping process prisoners from the country that had driven her family out, and probably worse. October arrived with cooler temperatures that felt like mercy after the brutal Texas summer, and with news that rippled through the camp like electricity through water. A shipment had arrived, from the Red Cross, donated items from American church groups. The camp commander would make an announcement after the evening meal. Greta sat on a wooden bench outside the mess hall with 24 other women, watching the sun sink toward a horizon that stretched impossibly far in every direction. The light here was different than Germany, bigger somehow, more exposed. She missed forests and close grey skies and the particular quality of autumn in Bavaria. Missed Anneliese with an ache that had become as fundamental as breathing, a constant background pain that occasionally spiked into something acute and unbearable. The camp commander was a middle-aged man with a slight paunch and tired eyes who spoke through a translator, his words coming slow and measured like he'd thought carefully about how to phrase this. Geneva Convention mandates that prisoners of war retain personal dignity. We have received donated items from charitable organizations, personal care supplies, lipstick, powder compacts, hand cream. You may accept these items if you choose. No one will be forced to take anything. The silence that followed felt physical, like the air had solidified. Greta felt shock move through the assembled women in a visible wave, saw faces register disbelief and confusion, and something that might have been hunger quickly suppressed. Makeup, feminine things, items that belonged to a world before war, before capture, before they'd been reduced to numbers and identical grey uniforms and the label enemy combatant. Liesel stood up fast enough that her bench scraped against concrete. Her voice rang out in German, and the translator struggled to keep up with the rapid-fire intensity. This is corruption. You want us to forget who we are, forget our loyalty, forget our men who are still fighting and dying. You want to make us soft and compliant and grateful to our captors. The camp commander listened to the translation, his face showing something that might have been weariness or might have been respect for conviction, even when he disagreed with it. "You're prisoners, not animals," he said through the translator. "The choice is yours. Make it or don't. Nobody here is forcing anything." The distribution happened in the mess hall, small cardboard boxes set out on long tables, women filing past in a line that moved slowly because everyone hesitated. Greta watched them reach out and pull back, torn between want and loyalty, between the visceral desire for something normal and beautiful, and the fear that accepting it meant betraying something essential. Some took nothing, walking past with faces set hard against temptation, using refusal as a form of resistance. Others grabbed items quickly and furtively, like the boxes might vanish, like someone might change their mind and take it all back. When Greta reached the table, Ruth stood there organizing supplies with methodical care, her hands moving efficiently through the task. Their eyes met, and Ruth gestured toward the boxes, her expression neutral, offering without pushing, making it genuinely optional in a way that felt foreign and disorienting. Greta's hand hovered over a compact, then a small jar of cream, then settled on a single tube of lipstick. Not bright red, nothing that would draw attention or look improper. Something deeper and more subdued, the kind of red a schoolteacher might wear on an ordinary weekday in an ordinary world that seemed like it had existed 1,000,000 years ago. "Good choice," Ruth said quietly in that careful German, and Greta closed her fingers around the tube. It weighed almost nothing but felt impossibly significant. "Why?" she heard herself ask before she could stop the question. "Why do you do this? Give us these things? Treat us like we matter?" Ruth's expression shifted, something painful moving beneath the professional surface. "Because when we forget people are human, we create camps," she said simply, like it was obvious. "On both sides. We create the things we should be trying to prevent." Greta returned to the barracks with the lipstick burning a metaphorical hole in her pocket, The small tube feeling like evidence of collaboration or weakness, or maybe just the stubborn insistence on remaining human despite everything trying to reduce you to something less. Around her, women argued in harsh whispers that occasionally escalated into near shouting before someone shushed them. The barracks felt fractured along invisible fault lines, split between those who'd taken items and those who'd refused, between those who saw the gesture as manipulation and those who saw it as simple decency. Roughly half had taken nothing, viewing the entire distribution as psychological warfare designed to make them complicit in their own imprisonment. The other half clutched small treasures like lifelines back to an identity that felt increasingly distant. That night, alone in the latrine after everyone else had gone to bed, Greta unscrewed the lipstick with shaking hands. The mirror above the sink was cracked, a spiderweb of fractures that distorted her reflection into fragments. She looked at herself, really looked for the first time in months. Thin face, hair going grey at the temples despite being only 32, eyes that looked older than they should. She raised the tube to her lips and paused with the colour barely touching skin. 3 years. 3 years since she'd worn lipstick, attended a parent-teacher conference, walked Annalise to kindergarten like a normal mother in a normal world, doing normal things. She applied the colour slowly and carefully, watching in the broken mirror as her mouth became defined again, became something other than a functional orifice for consuming rations and speaking when spoken to. The face looking back wasn't prisoner number 724, wasn't faceless enemy. Just a woman who was 32 years old and still breathing and still here and still someone's mother. For the first time since capture, Greta felt something that might have been the beginning of a smile, fragile and uncertain, but real. She wiped the lipstick off carefully and returned to her bunk, but she didn't throw the tube away, just tucked it into her footlocker like a secret worth keeping. December brought cold that seeped through the barracks walls despite the heating system that worked intermittently, and news that genuinely changed everything in ways the lipstick hadn't. The camp commander announced a new policy at evening assembly. Prisoners could write letters home, censored, obviously. Every word would be read and approved and potentially rejected, but if approved, the letters would actually be delivered through neutral Switzerland and the International Red Cross, delivered to families who probably thought their daughters and wives and mothers were dead or worse. Greta sat on her bunk that evening with a piece of paper and a stubby pencil, staring at blankness until her eyes burned and watered. Around her, other women hunched over their own letters, some writing furiously like words had been dammed up for months and were flooding out now, others frozen in the same paralysis Greta felt. What could you possibly say? How did you compress 18 months of separation and war and capture and confusion into a single page that strangers would read before deciding if your mother and daughter got to see it? She thought about Annalise's face in the photograph, tried to imagine her at 9 years old instead of 8. Taller, probably. Maybe the gap in her teeth had closed. Perhaps she'd started to forget what her mother's voice sounded like. The pencil trembled in Greta's grip hard enough that she had to set it down and breathe slowly until her hands steadied. She wrote the address first, her mother's house in the village outside Munich, the only place Annalise would be assuming they'd survived the bombing that had supposedly hit the city. Then she began, each word feeling simultaneously inadequate and enormous. Dearest Annalise, the food here is plain, but there is enough of it. My bed has a real pillow. They let me write to you, which is something I didn't think would happen. I think of you every morning when I wake up and every night before I fall asleep. I hope you are being good for grandmother. I hope you remember that I love you. Always, Mother. She didn't mention the lipstick, didn't mention Ruth's kindness or the donated supplies or the slowly growing realization that everything she'd been taught about Americans might be fundamentally wrong. Those truths were too strange, too unbelievable for a letter that would be read by censors and might confuse or worry a 9-year-old child. Better to keep it simple and safe and focused on the only thing that really mattered, which was that she was alive and thinking of her daughter constantly. Other women weren't as cautious. Greta overheard fragments of letters being read aloud for approval, some maintaining the propaganda line about expected brutal treatment even while experiencing the opposite, others describing the actual conditions in detail that felt dangerous to commit to paper. One woman wrote extensively about the mess hall food and the clean water and the medical care when someone got sick, small truths that felt like treason to speak aloud because they contradicted what everyone back home believed about American prisoner camps. 3 days after Greta mailed her letter, Liesel intercepted another prisoner near the latrine, a quiet, mouse-like woman named Margarete, who'd written about kindness in her letter, about being treated with respect by guards, about feeling safer here than she had during the last year of the war in Germany. Liesel had somehow obtained a copy of Margaret's letter, probably through a sympathizer who worked in the administrative office, and now she stood in the centre of the barracks, waving it like evidence of collaboration. "Listen to this." Liesel's voice cut through the evening quiet like broken glass. "They treat us with dignity. The Red Cross woman speaks beautiful German and remembers our names." She practically spat the words. "This is how it starts. This is how they corrupt us, make us forget what we're supposed to be fighting for, make us betray our country and our men." Margaret's face went white as milk. "We're not fighting anymore," she said quietly. "We lost. We're prisoners now. That's just reality." "We're still German," Liesel shot back, advancing on her. "We're still loyal to our country, even if our country is temporarily occupied. That lipstick, those letters, all of it is designed to make us weak, to make us complicit in our own defeat, to make us betray our people." She lunged for Greta's footlocker before anyone could react, yanked it open with both hands. The lipstick tube rolled out onto the floor, small and red and somehow accusatory. Liesel snatched it up and raised her fist like she was going to smash it against the floor. Greta moved without thinking, caught Liesel's wrist mid-swing with a grip hard enough to hurt. "No," she said firmly. For a moment they stood locked together, Liesel shaking with fury that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than anger about lipstick, Greta holding firm despite being afraid of confrontation, of violence, of all of this. Around them other women had risen from bunks, and Greta could see the barracks dividing in real time, some moving to support Liesel and her rigid loyalty, others shifting closer to Margaret and Greta in silent solidarity. "It's just lipstick," Greta said quietly but clearly. "It doesn't make us anything except human. Doesn't change who we are or where we came from or what we've lost. It's just colour for lips. Human." Liesel's laugh was jagged and broken. "They gave us makeup while our country burns, while our men die in trenches, while our cities get bombed into rubble. And you think that makes them good? Think accepting it makes us human instead of traitors?" "I think it means we're still ourselves," Greta said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "Not numbers, not faceless enemies who deserve whatever punishment we get. Still women and mothers and daughters, still people who deserve to exist." One of the older women, Frau Weber, with her grey hair and steady presence, stepped forward and gently pried the lipstick from Liesel's grip before the confrontation could escalate further. She handed it back to Greta, then turned to face the assembled women. "We can hate what happened to us," Frau Weber said in her teacher voice, the kind that commanded attention without shouting. "We can hate this war and hate being prisoners and hate being separated from our families. But we don't have to hate ourselves for surviving it. We don't have to punish ourselves more than we're already being punished." The tension held for another breath, vibrating in the air like a struck chord, then cracked. Liesel stumbled back to her bunk with her face crumpling, the rigid defiance collapsing into something more vulnerable. Some women followed her, murmuring support and agreement, maintaining the hard line about loyalty and resistance. Others returned to their letters and their small acts of maintaining connection across an ocean that felt wider every single day. That night Greta couldn't sleep. She lay in the dark, listening to muffled crying from Liesel's corner, to whispered conversations that never quite stopped, to the sounds of women trying to navigate between loyalty to where they came from and accommodation to where they were. The lipstick sat in her locker, and she understood suddenly what it had become beyond just colour for lips. It was proof. Proof they were still women, still mothers and daughters and teachers and clerks, and all the roles they'd had before the war reduced them to enemy combatants. Still people who deserved to exist beyond the labels war had forced onto them. Still human in ways that mattered when everything else had been stripped away. 3 months crawled past in a rhythm of laundry and meals and letters and the slow adjustment to captivity that wasn't brutal but wasn't freedom either. Then, in early March, Ruth found Greta in the laundry room during the afternoon shift and held out an envelope without saying anything. International postage, Swiss stamps, Red Cross markings. Greta's hands shook so badly she almost dropped it twice before she got it open. Inside was a single page in her mother's careful script, the handwriting Greta had known her entire life, and folded within that was a drawing on newsprint. Crayon on cheap paper. A woman with dark hair and a smile, standing in front of a house with flowers around it. Underneath, in a child's uncertain letters, careful and deliberate, Mama from Annalise. Greta pressed the drawing to her chest and wept, the kind of crying that came from somewhere below conscious thought, below language, just grief and relief and love all mixed together until they were indistinguishable. Ruth stood beside her, not speaking, not touching, just present in a way that somehow helped instead of making it worse. When Greta finally looked up, she saw tears on Ruth's face too. Different grief from different losses, but grief nonetheless, the universal language that transcended national borders and political allegiances. "She remembers you," Ruth said softly in that careful German. "She remembers you, and she's alive, and she's drawing pictures for you." Greta nodded, unable to speak, unable to do anything except hold the drawing and feel something beyond mere survival. She felt hope, fragile and terrifying and absolutely real, the possibility that there might be a future beyond this camp, beyond this war, beyond all the ways the world had broken. April arrived with wildflowers blooming along the camp fence in colours that seemed almost aggressive in their cheerfulness, and an announcement that drained every bit of colour from every face in the assembled group. Mandatory assembly in the mess hall. A newsreel. Footage from Europe. Liberation footage. The camp commander's expression was granite when he explained what they'd be shown, his voice harder than it had been for any previous announcement. Allied forces had been liberating camps as they advanced through Germany, and footage had been taken of what they'd found. "You're going to see this," he said through the translator. "You're going to see what was done in your country's name. And then you're going to understand why we fought." Greta filed into the mess hall with the others, her stomach already churning with dread that felt like premonition. She'd heard whispers, rumours that filtered through even the most carefully censored news. Labour camps where political enemies got sent. Concentration camps for Jews and other undesirables. Places where conditions were harsh but necessary for the war effort, or so the official line had always claimed. But propaganda had dismissed concerns as Allied exaggeration, as lies designed to turn German citizens against their own government. She'd believed the dismissals because questioning them had never occurred to her as an option, because the alternative was too horrible to contemplate, because accepting official explanations was easier than interrogating them. The lights dimmed. The projector whirred to life, casting flickering shadows before the image stabilized. The first thing on screen was gates, iron gates with words worked into the metal in that distinctive Gothic script. Arbeit macht frei. Work sets you free. Greta recognized the phrase from 100 propaganda posters, 1,000 speeches about the dignity of labour and the purification of the German state through productive work. Then the camera moved inside and the world ended. Bodies, piles of them. Not bodies in the sense of people who had died, but skeletal remains covered in paper-thin skin, stacked like cordwood in mass graves or dumped in heaps beside barracks. Living people who looked like animated corpses, eyes huge in skull faces, skin stretched over bones with no flesh in between, children with distended bellies from starvation and limbs like sticks. The narrator's voice was clinical, detached in that particular American way, listing numbers and locations. Bergen-Belsen, Dachau, Buchenwald, thousands dead, tens of thousands. The camera showed ovens, industrial ovens built specifically for burning human bodies, showed train cars packed with corpses, people who'd died in transit to the camps or during transport between camps, showed mass graves being bulldozed, Allied soldiers weeping openly as they tried to help survivors too weak to stand or walk or speak, showed German civilians from nearby towns being marched through the camps, forced to witness what had been done literally in their backyards, forced to see what they'd pretended not to know. Some of the civilians were crying, some looked shocked, some looked away or covered their mouths. The camera didn't let them escape, didn't let anyone escape. Greta felt the room tilt sideways, felt reality become unmoored from anything solid. Beside her, someone was retching, the sound of vomiting mixing with sobs. Someone else had gone completely silent, face slack with shock that looked like a different kind of death. Many women sat frozen, unable to move or speak or process what they were seeing. Allied propaganda, a voice whispered from somewhere behind Greta, has to be staged, has to be fake. They wouldn't. We wouldn't. Our country wouldn't do this. But even as the denial came out, it sounded hollow, desperate, the kind of thing you said when you needed it to be true but couldn't quite convince yourself anymore. Greta couldn't look away from the screen, couldn't unsee the children's faces or the mountains of shoes and eyeglasses and human hair. Couldn't unsee the medical experiment victims with their mutilated bodies and the survivors who looked at the camera with expressions beyond anything language could capture. And she knew with absolute certainty, the same certainty she'd felt when Ruth returned the photograph. This was real. This had happened. Her country had done this. The government she'd supported, the system she'd participated in, the propaganda she'd believed and taught to children had produced industrial-scale murder dressed up in language about purification and necessary measures and the protection of the German people from enemies within and without. The lipstick in her pocket felt obscene. How could she accept mercy, dignity, small kindnesses when her nation had built factories specifically designed for killing human beings? When she'd believed the lies, taught them to students in classrooms across Bavaria, sent her own daughter to youth meetings, because that's what good German mothers were supposed to do. When she'd watched Jewish neighbours disappear and told herself they were being relocated for their own safety, for the protection of the state, nothing more serious than that. The lights came back on and no one moved. The silence felt heavier than sound. The camp commander stood at the front, his face showing something that might have been rage, or might have been grief, or maybe both mixed together. "This is what we fought against," he said through the translator, his voice heavy with emotion held barely in check. "This is why we crossed an ocean and stormed beaches and lost hundreds of thousands of our own. We thought you should know what you were part of. What was done in your name." Greta stumbled outside into bright Texas afternoon sunlight that seemed completely wrong, too cheerful, too ordinary for what they'd just witnessed. Around her, women scattered in every direction, some running toward the barracks, others collapsing onto benches or simply sitting on the ground where they stood. The sound of weeping came from everywhere, overlapping waves of grief and horror, and something that might have been shame, if shame could be profound enough to encompass complicity in mechanized genocide. Liesel stood near the fence with both hands gripping the chain link hard enough that her knuckles had gone white, her whole body convulsing with sobs that weren't angry anymore, weren't defiant or rigid with conviction, just broken. The kind of crying that came from a world view shattering into pieces too small to ever reassemble into anything coherent. Greta found herself at the edge of the compound, staring at nothing, at everything, at the wildflowers that swayed in the breeze like nothing had changed. In the distance, a mockingbird sang, running through its repertoire of stolen songs, and the normalcy of it felt like mockery, or maybe just evidence that the world kept turning, regardless of human atrocity. She stood there until she lost track of time, until the sun had moved noticeably across the sky, until Ruth appeared at her side without announcement or fanfare. They stood together in silence for long minutes, neither speaking because what words could possibly address what they'd witnessed. Finally, Ruth's voice came quiet and completely wrecked underneath its careful control. My grandmother, my aunt and uncle, my cousins, all three of them, Bergen-Belsen. She stopped, swallowed audibly. My parents escaped in 1938. They managed to get out and bring me with them when I was 13. I found out last week through Red Cross channels that the others didn't make it, didn't escape, didn't survive. Greta turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time since the newsreel. Ruth's face was wet with tears, but her expression was somehow steady underneath the grief, like she'd already done the work of processing horror and come out the other side still standing. "You think I don't know what you carry," Ruth continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "I carry it too, different sides of it. Same grief, same questions about how people we loved, countries we loved, became capable of that." "How?" Greta's voice cracked completely. "How do you—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "How do you show us mercy after that? How do you treat us like humans when you know what our country did to your family? How do you bear to be in the same room with us?" Ruth was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the Texas landscape that stretched flat and endless in every direction. "Some days I can't," Ruth said finally, honest in a way that somehow made it hurt more. "Some days I look at all of you, and I just see their faces. My grandmother who used to make bread every Friday, my cousin Sarah who was 6 years old and loved books, my uncle who played violin. Some days I can barely stand to be here." Her voice broke, but she kept going. "But then I remember that hate is what created the camps in the first place. On both sides of this. Hate and fear and the willingness to see other people as less than human, as problems that needed solving through elimination. And if I let that same hate consume me, if I stop seeing you as human beings, then I become part of the cycle. Then they died for nothing because I'm perpetuating the exact thing that killed them." She reached over and took Greta's hand, held it firmly. "The lipstick isn't about forgetting what happened or pretending it wasn't as bad as it was. It's about remembering you're human even when it would be easier to forget. Because when we forget that, when anyone forgets that people are people regardless of what side they're on or what government they lived under, that's when we get camps. That's when we get ovens. That's when we get children in mass graves. The choice to see you as human despite everything isn't about you deserving it. It's about me choosing who I'm going to be, what kind of world I'm going to build going forward." Greta felt something crack open in her chest, something that had been frozen or calcified or just protected by layers of denial and self-preservation. But after what we did, after what my country did, how can any of us accept mercy? How can we take lipstick and write letters and pretend we deserve basic human dignity? Ruth's grip tightened. Because mercy isn't about deserving. It never has been. It's about choosing who we're going to be tomorrow, what kind of future we're going to build from the ashes of what was destroyed. The camps happened because people stopped seeing each other as human, started seeing certain groups as threats or problems or less deserving of life. The only way forward that doesn't just repeat the same patterns is to refuse to do that same thing. To insist on dignity even when, especially when, it would be easier or more justified to withhold it. The words settled into Greta like seeds into soil, uncomfortable and impossible to remove. Not easy. Not comfortable. Not something that resolved the horror or made anything okay. But true in a way that felt deeper than political allegiance or national identity or any of the categories war used to divide people into us and them. That night, the barracks was silent except for quiet weeping that continued for hours. No one used makeup. No one wrote letters. The small tokens of ordinary life, the drawings from children and photographs of families and tubes of lipstick and powder compacts, all of it felt impossibly tainted now, impossible to reconcile with what they'd seen, what they'd learned about their country, about themselves, about complicity and willful ignorance, and all the ways normal people participated in extraordinary evil by simply going along, by believing what they were told, by not questioning or resisting or doing anything except surviving. Greta lay awake with the lipstick tube cold against her palm. She wanted to throw it away, wanted to reject every single kindness she'd been shown, wanted to punish herself with the same brutality her country had inflicted on millions of innocent people, whose only crime was being born into groups the Reich had declared enemies. But Ruth's words kept circling in her mind, refusing to let her settle into comfortable self-flagellation. When we forget people are human, we get camps, on both sides. Maybe mercy wasn't about deserving. Maybe it was about choosing to break the cycle instead of perpetuating it, choosing to remember humanity even when, especially when, it would be easier and more justifiable to forget. The choice felt impossible and necessary and absolutely terrifying. The weeks after the newsreel passed in grey fog, where colours seemed muted and nothing tasted right, and conversations happened in monotone, Greta moved through her days mechanically, going through motions of laundry and meals and sleep, but feeling disconnected from all of it, like she was watching herself from a great distance through thick glass. The lipstick stayed buried at the very bottom of her footlocker under everything else, and letters from Annalise went unanswered because what could she possibly say now? How did you explain to your 9-year-old daughter that everything you'd believed and taught her was built on foundations of systematic murder? That the country you'd loved and served had created industrial systems specifically designed to eliminate entire populations of human beings? Around her, the camp had transformed from a place where women had slowly, cautiously begun to smile and laugh and reclaim tiny pieces of themselves into something that felt more like a tomb. Women who'd accepted donated items now left them untouched. The barracks felt heavy with unspoken horror and collective shame and questions nobody knew how to answer. Even the spring weather, warm and bright with new growth everywhere, seemed like cosmic mockery, nature continuing its cycles, while human civilization revealed itself capable of mechanized genocide disguised as political necessity. One evening in late April, Greta sat alone on the barracks steps, watching the sun sink low and painting the Texas sky in shades of orange and purple that would have been beautiful if she'd been capable of seeing beauty anymore. She didn't hear Ruth approach until the other woman settled beside her on the steps, leaving space between them but offering quiet presence that had become familiar over months of brief afternoon interactions. They sat in silence for several minutes, both looking at the sunset without really seeing it. Then Ruth spoke, her voice soft and distant, like she was talking more to herself than to Greta. My grandparents owned a bookshop in Frankfurt, corner of 2 streets whose names I can barely remember now. My father used to tell me stories about it, how they'd stay open late on Friday nights, how the whole neighbourhood would come to argue about literature and philosophy and everything else, how it was a place where ideas mattered more than anything. She paused, gathering words or gathering courage, or maybe both. My mother's family were musicians. Her brother, my uncle Jakob, he played violin in the Berlin Philharmonic, first chair. My father said he could make the instrument sing in ways that made grown men cry. My grandmother on my mother's side was a piano teacher. My cousin Sarah wanted to be a dancer. She was 6 years old and already so graceful. Ruth's hands were clasped tight in her lap, knuckles showing white. They didn't leave when my parents did. They thought it would blow over, thought being German first would protect them, thought their neighbours who'd known them for decades would shield them from whatever was happening. Thought wrong. I'm sorry, Greta said, and the words felt grotesquely inadequate. Felt like trying to bail out an ocean with a teaspoon. Ruth turned to look at her directly. You think I don't understand what you're carrying? You think I don't know what it's like to love a country that became capable of that? To have participated, even passively, even through ignorance, in systems that destroyed people? I carry that too. Different side of it, different role, but same questions, same horror at discovering what we're capable of when we stop seeing each other as equally human. How? Greta's throat closed around the word. How do you not hate us? How do you look at us every day and not see the people who built the ovens, who ran the camps, who killed your family? Ruth was quiet for a long time, long enough that Greta thought maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe the question was too much. Then she spoke slowly, carefully, like she was working through it even as she explained it. Some days I do hate you, all of you collectively. Some days I can barely force myself to come to work because looking at German faces makes me physically ill. Some days I go home and cry for hours because I keep seeing my grandmother's face in yours, my cousin in the young women here, and I imagine what their last moments were like. Whether they knew it was coming, whether they were afraid, whether they called for someone to help and nobody came. Her voice broke, but she continued. But then I remember that hate is what created the camps originally. Hate and fear and the decision that some people, weren't really deserving of life or dignity or mercy. And if I let that same hate control me, if I stop seeing you as human beings who are also victims of the same system that killed my family, then I'm doing exactly what created this nightmare in the first place. She reached over and took Greta's hand again, held it firmly despite the trembling in both their grips. The lipstick isn't about absolving you or pretending what happened wasn't that bad or moving past it too quickly. It's about insisting that you're still human even after everything. Because the alternative where we decide some people aren't human enough to deserve basic dignity, that's how we got here. That's the thinking that builds camps and designs ovens and creates systems where murder becomes bureaucratic procedure. The only way forward that doesn't just repeat everything is to refuse to do that. To choose mercy, not because anyone deserves it, but because without it we just perpetuate the same cycles of dehumanization that caused all this suffering. The words landed in Greta like stones dropping into still water, sending ripples outward that disturbed everything. But how can I accept mercy when I didn't resist? When I went along with everything, believed the propaganda, taught it to children, participated in the system even if I didn't know the full extent? How can any of us? Ruth's grip tightened. Because you're going to have to live with what you did and didn't do for the rest of your life. Because you're going to carry that knowledge forever. And the question isn't whether you deserve mercy, it's what you're going to do with it. Are you going to use it to become bitter and defensive? Or are you going to use it to become someone who refuses to ever participate in dehumanization again? Someone who teaches truth instead of propaganda? Someone who questions instead of blindly accepting? That choice is the only thing that matters now. The next morning, Greta found Liesl sitting alone behind the laundry building with her back against the sun-warmed wood, staring at nothing with eyes that looked like they'd seen too much and would never quite close properly again. The young woman looked hollowed out, decades older than her 22 years, all the rigid conviction and fierce loyalty burned away by newsreel footage that couldn't be unseen or explained away. Greta had heard through barracks whispers that Liesl had stopped eating except when forced, stopped speaking except in monosyllables, spent most nights awake and staring at the ceiling or weeping quietly into her pillow. Greta sat down beside her without asking permission, without offering platitudes or false comfort, just sat and shared the space and the silence. After an hour, Liesl's voice came barely audible, scraped raw from crying or not using it enough. My whole family died in Dresden. The firebombing. My parents, my 2 brothers, my grandmother, everyone. I thought... She stopped, swallowed with visible effort. I thought if I believed hard enough, if I stayed loyal enough to what they'd believed in, their deaths would mean something, would be for something greater than just random violence, would be part of some larger purpose or plan. I know, Greta said quietly, meaning it. But it was all lies, Liesl continued, her face starting to crumple. They died believing lies. I hated people for lies. I was ready to die for lies. Everything I thought I knew about the world, about Germany, about what we were fighting for, it was all built on mass murder dressed up in language about protecting the homeland and purifying the nation and defending against enemies who turned out to be just people, just human beings who wanted to live. Greta reached into her pocket and pulled out the lipstick tube that she'd almost thrown away 100 times, held it out in her palm. This isn't about being German or American. It's not about forgetting what happened or pretending the horror wasn't real or moving past it before we've dealt with it. It's about deciding who we're going to be tomorrow, what we're going to teach our children, whether we're going to perpetuate the thinking that created the camps or refuse to ever participate in it again. Liesl stared at the tube like it was something alien, incomprehensible. How can you use that? How can you accept kindness after what we saw, after what our country did? Because Ruth is right, Greta said, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. When we stop being human, when we let ourselves become just our worst moments and nothing else, that's when we create more camps, more ovens, more children in mass graves. This lipstick is me choosing to still be a person, to still be Annalise's mother who's going to go home someday and tell her the truth about everything. About the propaganda we believed and the camps our country built and the mercy I received despite not deserving it. About how small kindnesses matter, especially when everything else is broken. About how we move forward by refusing to dehumanize anyone ever again. She pressed the lipstick into Liesl's shaking hand. I can't tell you what to do with it, but I can tell you that punishing yourself doesn't undo anything that happened, doesn't bring anyone back, doesn't make anything better. All it does is add more suffering to a world that already has too much. Liesl's fingers closed around the tube slowly, like she was afraid it might burn her or might disappear if she gripped too hard. She didn't use it, didn't apply colour or look at herself in any mirrors, just held it like an anchor to something beyond punishment and shame and the weight of knowledge that couldn't be unknown. Over the following weeks, something shifted incrementally in the camp, not healing because the wounds were too deep and too fresh for anything like healing, but a kind of movement beyond paralysis. Women began to organise a small memorial service that acknowledged their own losses and the camp's victims in the same breath, holding both griefs simultaneously without trying to balance or compare them. No easy forgiveness, no pretending the horror could be erased or explained away or moved past quickly. Just shared grief and the tentative recognition that they could carry both sorrow for what was done and determination not to perpetuate it. On May 8th, news rippled through the camp like electricity. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was officially over. Women gathered in small groups, some weeping with relief, others with something more complicated than relief, something that mixed the end of active warfare with the knowledge of what had been done, what they'd been part of whether they knew it or not, what they'd have to reckon with for the rest of their lives. Greta sat at a table in the mess hall and pulled out paper and pencil. This time the words came easier, or at least more necessarily. She wrote to her daughter with hands that only trembled slightly. Dearest Annalise, I'm coming home, though I don't know exactly when. Before I do, I want you to know the truth about everything, about the propaganda we believed and taught in schools, about the camps our country built and what happened there, about the lipstick the Americans let me keep and what it means, about mercy I didn't deserve, but received anyway, about Ruth who lost her whole family to the camps but still chose to see us as human. I want you to grow up knowing the whole truth even when it's ugly and shameful and hard to bear. I want you to understand that small kindnesses matter, especially when everything else is broken. That mercy isn't about deserving, it's about refusing to perpetuate dehumanization. That we move forward not by forgetting or making excuses, but by choosing to be different, to be better, to refuse to ever participate in that kind of evil again. That's what I learned here in Texas in a prisoner camp where I expected brutality and found basic human decency instead. That's what I'm bringing home to you.